Well, it gives me great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Erika McEntarfer, who is the Commissioner of Labor Statistics. She was confirmed a little over a year ago. I believe she took over the position, right? Dr. McEntarfer is a labor economist who served over 20 years in federal government with positions at the U.S. Census Bureau, the Executive Office of the President, the Department of the Treasury. Before the BLS, she was a senior economist at the White House Council of Economic Advisors, sort of like a detailed advising White House officials on the labor market recovery from the pandemic. She has a long list of research publications with a focus on the consequences of job loss, wage rigidity, and the interactions between firms and workers in the economy. Her work has been published in the Journal of Labor Economics, the American Economic Journal of Macroeconomics, the Journal of Economic Perspectives. She has a bachelor's degree in social science from Bard College and a PhD in economics from Virginia Tech. So, without further ado, let me welcome Dr. McEntarfer.
You're a little taller than me. How's that? Great. So, good afternoon, and thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. And thanks so much for the opportunity to speak here in Atlanta today. One of my favorite things is getting out of DC and talking to businesses, economists, and analysts around the country. And it's just people who use the data. And it's just really great to all see you here. So since it is my first time here, that was an excellent introduction, but I'll say a few things about myself. So my main area of research, I'm a labor economist, my main area of research is labor market dynamics, specifically how firms and workers interact and respond to changing economic conditions. And for much of my career, I ran a research lab at the Census Bureau that produced new workforce statistics. And I've also worked at tax policy at the Treasury Department and recently served as the senior labor economist at the Council of Economic Advisors. That's all to say that I've been interested in economic measurement for a very long time. But like everyone who lived through the last 5 years, I've developed a deeper appreciation for the importance of timely economic data. Economic indicators have been essential for understanding the depths of the downturn in the economy from the pandemic, the pace of inflation, as well as the often surprising path of the U.S. economic recovery. The unusual nature of the pandemic recession really upended a lot of conventional wisdom about how business cycles behave, and even several years into this recovery, the data can still really surprise us. So I'm glad to have the opportunity to be with you here at the start of the year, because it seems a good moment to look back on the economic data over the last year and what it tells us about current economic conditions. I'm setting up the next speaker who's going to talk about the future. I'm going to talk a lot about the present. I'm then going to touch on the importance of the official data in understanding the state of the economy and explain why federal economic indicators remain fundamental to understanding economic conditions today. I've also got here PCE inflation, which is the price index that is targeted by the Federal Reserve. That was 2.4% in November and slightly above the Fed's 2% target. Importantly for the Fed, it does appear that inflation expectations remain well anchored around 2%. Consumers and businesses do expect that despite having just experienced a period of high inflation, many for the first time in their lives, inflation will return to target. So that's really good news for the Fed because one of the main drivers of inflation is what we all expect it to be because so many contracts are forward-looking. So looking specifically on the progress on inflation in the last year, the pace of disinflation definitely slowed from the really rapid pace that we saw in 2023. But the disinflation path also got a bit bumpier in 24. So on the slide here, I have core PCE inflation. That nets out some of the noisier price indices, food and energy in particular. So you can see here the core PCE rose 0.5% last January, which was a notable acceleration from the average monthly pace that we saw of 0.15% in the last quarter of 23. And this rapid acceleration in prices in the early part of last year really put a lot of economists on pause. Together with some unexpected strength that we saw in consumer spending and hiring at the end of 23, lots of people were concerned, like, was this a temporary acceleration in prices or a more sustained reheating of the economy? As you can see, it proved temporary, and average monthly price increases in core inflation were less than 0.2% in the last part of the year. So much of the stickiness in inflation right now is coming from goods whose prices increase with a lag, housing and car insurance in particular. Shelter inflation has proven very sticky. Demand for housing really rose sharply in the first part of the pandemic, and housing supply in the US does not respond very rapidly. It takes a long time for new homes and new apartments to be built. It also turns out that leases for existing tenants get repriced pretty slowly. So it's usually annual, and it takes time for a landlord to want to get an existing tenant up to current market rates. And that also creates lags in the inflation data. Given how close inflation is to target, right above the target level inflation, I suspect the Fed is going to continue to watch the incoming data very closely, as whether inflation moves closer or further away from the 2% target is likely to influence their decision-making going forward. The Fed might be very comfortable with 2.4, but they might be less comfortable if it bumps back up to 3. And of course, they'll be very happy if it bumps back down to 2. So turning away from inflation and looking at the labor market data over 24. So the jobs report released by BLS is arguably one of the most important economic indicators for understanding economic conditions. So why is that? A key reason, of course, is it's giving us really important information about demand and supply conditions in the US labor market. But another, maybe less appreciated reason is that it's very timely. So it's more timely than other key economic data we're going to get, like GDP. So this graph shows the path of jobs gains over the last 3 years. Because economic data and the real economy can actually be quite noisy on a month-to-month basis, I like to look at the 3-month moving average of jobs gains. That allows you to more clearly extract signal from noise. So as you can see, the pace of hiring slowed in 2024, particularly in the second and third quarters of the year. And we ended the year with a very strong jobs report, indicating the economy added 256,000 jobs in December and bumped up the 3-month moving average pace of jobs gains to 170,000. So I've also included here the median forecast for payroll growth that forecasters released at the end of 23. And you can see that at the end of 23, forecasters were expecting a real rapid deceleration in jobs gains in the early part of the year. That did not happen. The strength in payroll gains in the first part of the year really did surprise many. Probably some of that is going to get shaved off with the benchmark revision that's going to be released next month, but it's not going to fundamentally change the story. It's still going to be a very steady year of job gains. So, but you can see the pace of jobs gain did decelerate in the later part of the year, and by the fourth quarter of the year, we really are just above what forecasters expected. So, as many forecasters expected, we did see some cooling of the labor market in 2024. So on the pace of jobs gains, the most common question I got when I was traveling to events this last year was about the divergence we saw in 2024 in employment growth in the payroll and household surveys. So as background, the jobs report consists not of one, but of 2 surveys. The payroll survey is really designed to measure employment growth at establishments. The household survey is needed to capture unemployment among workers. So this graph here shows the path of employment growth in both the business and household surveys. The black line is the payroll survey, and the dotted gray line is the household survey. Since the household survey includes jobs that aren't in the payroll survey, the blue line adjusts the household survey employment to the payroll survey concepts to make these series more compatible. Okay, so now that I've described what you're seeing here, as you can see, despite being sourced from 2 different surveys, these 2 series usually track each other very well. However, they diverged significantly in 24 with continued jobs growth in the payroll survey and almost no employment growth in the household survey. Household survey employment over 24 is basically flat. So why are they diverging? And which one should you lean on more heavily for your interpretation? So a likely suspect for the divergence was the census population estimates. These are used to weight up the household survey to national totals, and they can miss. That was actually the issue the last time these series diverged in the 90s, which is one reason I've got this long time series here, so you can see the last miss. So a CBO report released this summer used administrative data on entry into the United States, suggesting that census estimates of net immigration were too low. And this December, actually right before Christmas, Census announced changes to how they're estimating net immigration flows, incorporating more administrative data. And these new population estimates bring the census data much closer to the CBO estimate. So these new POP estimates are going to be incorporated in the household survey with the release of the January jobs report next month. We'll have to wait to see what the data look like in February. We're actually still waiting to get the POP estimates from Census right now. But it does appear that, once again, challenges in estimating immigration flows into the US, which is very challenging, drove a wedge between these two surveys. So we usually tell people, lean on the payroll survey. It's designed to measure payroll employment growth. And when they diverge, it usually is the household survey. That does appear to be the case again. So let's turn to talking about unemployment. So the unemployment rate edged up during the first part of the year from 3.7% last January to 4.2% in July. This sudden pace of cooling in the labor markets was a big reason why the Fed cut half a point at their September meeting. However, unemployment rates did something unusual. They stabilized, and they've actually been pretty flat through the second half of 2024. And they closed out in December at 4.1%. So why did unemployment edge up from these very low rates that we saw in early 23? Layoffs have not risen. They actually remain very steady and low by historical standards. But layoffs aren't the only thing that impact unemployment rates in the economy. A good analogy for unemployment is that it's a bit like a bathtub. Layoffs and entry are the tap, they pour water into the tub, and workers exit unemployment by either finding a job or giving up their search, and that's the drain. So even if there's only a trickle into that tub, even if layoffs are low and entry is low, if the drain clogs, your bathtub's gonna start filling up. And that's essentially what's happening now. So the rise in unemployment is largely driven by a decline in the job finding rate for unemployed workers. So in the very hot labor markets we had in 23 and 22, the job finding rate for unemployed people was almost 1 in 3 unemployed persons found a job every month. You can see now it's down to 1 in 4. So it's taking longer for workers to find jobs because the pace of jobs gains, while steady, it has slowed, and turnover, importantly, is now back to pre-pandemic levels, so there are fewer vacancies. And so with fewer firms hiring, it's taking job seekers longer to find the right job. That's not actually unusual. Outflows are typically more important than inflows in determining the level of unemployment in the economy. But an interesting aspect of the recent situation is that much of this rise is driven by unemployed workers who keep looking for jobs instead of exiting the labor market. Labor market participation actually remains quite high despite cooling in the labor market. That's really good news for the US because we actually need pretty high labor force participation because we have an aging workforce. So let me now turn away from labor markets and talk a bit about productivity. So one of the more interesting developments in 2024 was the sustained growth of labor productivity, which is now above the 2009 to 2019, basically the last expansion trend. So productivity data is quite noisy, even at the annual level of change, so you need to be cautious when looking at recent trends, but there were two developments in the last year that were very encouraging. One, the incoming productivity data has generally been very good, with annual growth rates of 2% or greater. Second, BEA revisions to GDP growth released earlier this year indicated that the post-COVID economy grew faster than previously believed, which boosted estimates of productivity growth even further. So why do economists get so excited about labor productivity? So when BLS releases productivity data, it's not typically front page news. But productivity is essential to understanding economic growth and wages. Boosts to productivity mean that an economy can produce more goods for the same amount of work, and that means that economic growth will be faster, which improves living standards. So a long-run perspective, I think here is very useful for putting the recent developments in context. So this graph here shows productivity growth since the mid-1960s. So as I said, productivity data can be really noisy. So here I'm showing you 5-year growth rates annualized, which nets out a lot of the noise in the productivity data and allows you to more clearly see trends. So looking over this last half century, you can see the 1970s were characterized by this big slowdown in labor productivity from the post-war era. There's no consensus on what caused this slowdown, but many economists point to a decline in business investment in the aftermath of the oil price shocks in the 1970s. Then we have an investment boom in the 1990s, driven by the growth of the internet, which caused productivity to surge again. And it stayed pretty high through the early aughts, and then right before the Great Recession began to fall, and productivity fell for almost the next 2 decades and remained sluggish throughout the entire recovery from the Great Recession. So one reason why economists get really excited about the recent productivity data is because we'd been previously pretty concerned about this very sluggish growth that we've had since the early aughts, and that we might be entering a period in which we were looking at just much slower productivity gains, an era of slower economic growth. So a return to 2% growth rates is actually really good news, although it's too soon to know for sure how lasting a trend this is going to be. So what's driving this productivity growth? Everyone's thoughts immediately jump to AI, and that might be the case in time, but it's too soon. A more likely cause of the surge in productivity is the many changes in the US economy since the onset of the COVID pandemic. So firms unable to find workers 2 years ago invested really heavily in more efficient processes and may now be reaping the benefits from those investments. So businesses learn new ways to operate. There are QR codes instead of paper menus at restaurants. And video conferencing is more common now instead of time-consuming business trips. Another thing that happened was business formation boomed in the aftermath of the pandemic, and new firms traditionally bring with them new innovations and boost productivity growth. Another thing that happened was that workers, for their part, moved themselves into better paying and higher skilled jobs. The rate of job hopping in the post-pandemic period likely led to better job matches where workers can find more productive use of their skills. So this is speculation in some part. Productivity is can be characterized as the measure of what we don't really understand. It's the magic juice of the economy, but those are the prime suspects for what's happening now. It's possible that investments in AI that businesses are making today will lead to another period of sustained productivity growth, such as we saw in the 1990s. It's just much too soon to say. So let's talk a bit about AI and its potential impacts on the economy. So I find it's very helpful when talking about AI to first define what we mean when we talk about AI. So interest in AI exploded with the launch of ChatGPT in 2022. But while it's recent advances in generative AI that have fueled widespread interest in artificial intelligence, AI is a really much broader field that includes the fields of computer vision, natural language processing, and robotics. So why is that important? These other fields have also had really steady pace of advances over the last decade, and many of us use these technologies in our everyday lives in ways that would have seemed like science fiction 20 years ago. So if your car has a lane departure warning system, you're using AI on your way to work. I was just in San Francisco, where the streets downtown are full of these autonomous Waymo taxis. They're very cool, by the way. If you go to San Francisco or Phoenix, that's where they also are. You definitely must take one. And there are also apps in wide use that will scan and translate foreign language menus and labels for you. I cook a lot of Chinese food, but I don't read Chinese. So I go to H Mart with my little app and read all the food labels so I don't accidentally come home with something I don't know how to cook. I'm actually also using AI right now. There's an app that's listening to me speak, and it's moving through my notes based on where it thinks I am. If you see me touching the screen, that's because it jumped too far ahead in the talk. Like most AI, it's a marvel, but it can make mistakes. And like most AI, it also trains us. I now stick much more closely to my talking points to avoid it jumping ahead. So the question right now that everyone's asking is, what will be the broader impact of AI advances on the economy? I was just at the annual meeting of economists in San Francisco, and every third panel was some version of this question. Like, there was one guy who gave like 5 talks at every session. You could hear his take at 5 times. So even though there's widespread interest in this topic, it's an extremely difficult one to answer. The economic history of technological change is mostly a story of predictions that turned out to be hilariously wrong. So I'm going to let others make predictions. Maybe your next speaker is going to look forward, is going to make some more bold predictions. So I'm going to focus on what we know from the available data today. So what do we know? First, and this may surprise you given the amount of hype around AI adoption by firms is still quite low, even though it is growing. So until recently, there was no data on this at all, and we were just flying in the dark. We didn't know what businesses were doing. Fortunately, that's no longer the case. There are some new census business surveys that show about 13% of workers are employed at a firm using AI. The share of firms, because these tend to be larger firms, is much smaller. It's about 2%. Unfortunately, census business data, these particular surveys, aren't very timely. So these surveys cover the period right before the launch of ChatGPT, so before this current era of interest. But remember that AI, a lot of this has been around for over a decade. There is now some more timely data from Census on adoption since the launch of ChatGPT from their Business Trends and Outlook survey. And it shows that adoption has grown in recent years and is now just around 6% of businesses. And a larger share, like 10 to 12%, have some plans to adopt AI. Adoption is extremely concentrated in tech industries. It's also in manufacturing and some other sectors. It's not widespread across the economy. And the most common uses, they found the Business Trends and Outlook survey, are marketing and help desk functions, such as this somewhat sad-looking virtual assistant here who kind of reminds me of Marvin, the depressed robot from Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. So importantly, despite these virtual agents, I was in San Francisco. I drove by a very dystopian billboard, which was like, stop hiring humans. There's no evidence that anyone has stopped hiring humans yet. The employment effects of AI, all the evidence to date is that they are pretty much non-existent. Some firms are increasing their hiring, but most report no effect at all. So what about future impacts on workers? So I didn't generate a slide for this, but I do want to elaborate on why labor economists urge caution in predicting workforce impacts from technological change. As I said, we've been hilariously wrong a lot. So it's useful to look at some examples from our past to give an indication of how technological change tends to work its way through the economy. So the first Easy Pass was installed in the mid-1990s, but it actually took 30 years for toll workers to largely disappear from the landscape. I have an uncle who's a toll worker. He just retired. There are almost no toll workers anymore. This is a pretty straightforward case of a labor substituting technology replacing a worker, but it still took a really long time for cities, states, and drivers to adopt to this change. I mean, mid-1990s, that was 30 years ago. And that was long enough for a lot of long tenured workers to retire without being displaced. The lesson here is that adoption of new technologies generally takes longer than you think. Another example. At the same time as the Easy Pass was rolling out, expansion of ATMs was widely predicted to eliminate bank teller jobs. So instead, as it turns out, the banking industry used the cost savings from ATMs to expand in new services. And the number of bank locations and tellers grew. Young people here, it didn't used to be the case there was a bank on every corner. Really did not. That was not what my childhood looked like. There are now banks on every corner. The teller jobs changed. They turned into more complex customer service roles, which probably made their jobs more interesting and less rote, but there were more of them. So the lesson here is that even when technology appears to be labor replacing, it can turn out to be labor enhancing. And it can change the task composition of jobs, but not displace any workers. I'll give one more example, more recent. 10 years ago, advances in autonomous vehicle technology led many to predict the end of taxi and truck driving as a profession within a short time span. This was like the era in which Uber valuations were so high, if you can recall. So today, there are autonomous vehicles on the road. I took one last week. But they're limited capacities, and drivers actually remain in pretty high demand, in part due to the expansion of e-commerce, which increased demand for drivers. So again, the lessons here are widespread adoption is not guaranteed, even when technology is very, very promising. And again, demand matters. So in short, lots of factors impact how new technologies will reshape labor markets. And so we're just going to have to wait and see what the impacts of these recent advances are. We will see them eventually in the occupation trends data, but they're really hard to predict in advance. So to sum up, 2024 was a year where supply and demand moved in a more harmonious balance. Inflation did continue to cool. For businesses, hiring's no longer the challenge it was earlier in the post-COVID recovery. More workers have moved into the labor market, and competition for workers from other firms has slowed as vacancies have fallen and turnover has fallen. And there's also been really promising developments for the pace of economic growth going forward, with gains in labor productivity and lots of investment in AI and other technologies. So in the last part of my talk, I want to touch on the importance of the federal data in understanding the state of the economy and explain why even now, with all the data that we are awash in our digital economy, the official economic indicators remain fundamental to understanding economic conditions. So the Bureau of Labor Statistics produces some of the most closely watched economic indicators in the nation. When the BLS releases key data on employment, unemployment, and inflation, it moves markets because it is some of the most timely and accurate information on economic conditions that the Federal Reserve, policymakers, and businesses have. And this remains true after decades of technological and methodological advances in computer and data science and the entry of many private sector providers into the economic information space. So 15 years ago, I attended a lot of talks where economists confidently predicted that economic indicators for prices and employment would mostly be produced by the private sector using private sector data in the very near future. But I've got Adriana Kugler's quote up here, which I think sums up the present view of most data watchers today. Private sector data is a very nice complement to official data, but it is no substitute. Tom Barkin's view is very similar. This is from an interview he gave on the Odd Lots podcast about how he looks at other more faster moving data, but he doesn't really update his priors about the state of the labor market and the economy until the official data is out. So why do we still need the official data? I actually get this question at events all the time. Not usually when I'm up on the podium, usually when I'm like working the room. I don't think people want to ask me like, why does your job need to exist when I'm up here? But like young people in particular, why can't we just use payroll firm data or online job listings or scrape all this information from the internet? Why do we still need to collect and curate official data? And the answer is that it has been really challenging to replicate or improve on the quality of economic indicators produced by the statistical agencies. And this remains true even as response rates to federal surveys have fallen. The statistical agencies, they have real advantages in the production of high quality statistics. First, and very importantly, they maintain universe sample frames for sampling and weighting. Having that frame turns out to be essential because you really understand your sample very well, which is an advantage that private sector providers do not have. A second factor is just the technical and operational expertise of the career staff who produce the official data. It just doesn't make a lot of operational sense for most private sector companies to employ vast teams of statisticians to do some of the esoteric work involved in producing data, like developing seasonal adjustment models, for instance. I'm an economist, I have tried to develop my own seasonal adjustment models. Leave that stuff to the time-serious statisticians. Keep amateurs away. As soon as you get a big crash like COVID, all your models will break, and you will need one of them to fix it. So I want to be clear, however, that there are real advantages to using commercial data, particularly in times of crisis, such as we just experienced with the COVID pandemic. So when a crisis hits, the high-frequency nature of commercial payroll data is going to get you a more timely picture of the impact than the monthly indicators produced by the statistical agencies will. So there's actually a large research team at the Federal Reserve, not here in Atlanta, they're one of the ones in DC. They've been using higher frequency commercial data to develop more timely economic data, and they now have a good body of research available on this project. And the slide I have here actually summarizes their Brookings paper on the advantages and disadvantages of using commercial data to track the economy. And I will say these are their views, but they have mirrored views I've heard elsewhere from research teams at investment banks and also in academia who all increased their use of commercial data during the pandemic. So in a crisis, commercial data is both more timely and more granular. More timely data is extremely useful to policymakers because you're often rushing to make decisions in time of crisis. You can't wait for the monthly data if the crisis is happening really fast. The granularity of commercial data is also really useful in times of disasters, as disasters are often highly localized. We're in the middle of a very serious fire in Los Angeles. The damage is going to be highly concentrated, even though Los Angeles is a very large place. Payroll data will help us identify some of those impacts. So actually at BLS, we have a research project focused on using data from payroll providers to help us improve estimates of state and local employment impacts of disasters, and the early results are promising. During the initial COVID wave, commercial data was also very useful in tracking the immediate impacts in domains where there was no official data. So you may recall at the early part of the pandemic, there was a collapse in restaurant reservations and open table, a drop in key card swipes at commercial buildings, and a decline in just personal mobility measured in cell phone data. It probably does not make any sense for taxpayers to fund the government to track restaurant reservations on an ongoing basis, but it was particularly useful in that moment in time that we had all this commercial data that we could use. But it turns out for monitoring economic conditions outside of a crisis, the challenges of using commercial data can be substantial. The costs tend to be lower for academic teams, but prices, first, they can be costly to acquire. My AI jumped ahead. They are costly to acquire. The cost tends to be lower for academics, but the prices offered to businesses and the federal government are substantially higher. And this can make finding cost savings in using commercial data rather than collecting it yourself hard to find. There are also holdover problems, unexpected changes to methodology of the company collecting the data. Most commercial data has a short time series, which makes seasonal adjustment, you need 5 years of data to do a seasonal adjustment model, makes it very difficult, especially when there's sample turnover. Basically, when economic conditions are changing more slowly, which is the situation we're in now and the situation we're in usually, the challenges of extracting signal from noise in commercial data are substantial. Of course, we face real challenges at the federal level as well, which endanger much of the official data that I've been talking about today and that we currently rely on. So most of our official data depends on surveys, and response rates to surveys are down here in the US and worldwide. Actually kind of luckier here in the US. They've collapsed faster in many parts of Europe. Businesses and households are harder to reach, and there's a decline in the willingness to participate in surveys. The good news here is that for now, declines in survey response rates have not impacted the accuracy of the economic data. The samples we collect are smaller, yes, but they're still representative of the larger population that we're trying to measure. The bad news is that looking forward, the current situation is likely not sustainable. Response rates have stabilized since some of the steep declines we saw in the early part of the pandemic, but they're likely to continue to trend down. Survey costs are escalating, and budgets for surveys are flat or declining. BLS's budget for data collection has declined 18% in real terms over the last 15 years. So if commercial data isn't a great substitute and the official statistics are in jeopardy, what is the path from here? Our goal at BLS is to modernize the official statistics for the 21st century and to try and get them on a sustainable path for the future. For surveys, we're focused on adapting response modes to make it easier for businesses and households to provide data. We're also using a lot more blended data, adding commercial data where we can, administrative data where we can, so we can focus those survey efforts on data that's not easily found elsewhere. So if we succeed, the US can continue to have this rich set of high-quality economic data for you, your businesses, your communities, and this nation. So I will now conclude, but I wanted to thank those of you in this room today who analyze all of this data and allow policymakers, consumers, and businesses to make decisions. It's really your hard work that puts this data into practice and, allows it to be really used. And I'd also especially like to thank every person and business here who took the time and effort to respond to a federal survey. Without you, businesses and policymakers really would be flying blind with much less information on economic conditions to navigate with. And let me thank the Atlanta Economics Club again for having me here. It was a pleasure to talk to you all today. Thank you so much.